The fascist system is a machine that eats people, and it's not going to stop until it has run out of people. And we have to really look at just how debased this ideology is, and how inhumane, how cruel, how brutal, how celebratory in all of those things. It's all bad, and it's none of it good. It is purposeful. It is something that is being celebrated by people who are cheered by cruelty and by destruction. And that, perhaps more than anything, is the drumbeat of dread that we're being forced to feel.
Welcome to episode 240 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. The Refuse Fascism podcast exposes and analyzes the threat we face, promotes efforts to defend people targeted by the fascists, and most essentially, challenge, mobilize, and inspire the non-fascist majority of people living in the United States to engage in determined, defiant, collective action to defeat Trump and MAGA fascism. I want to thank our patrons, our sustainers who make this show possible. Join our community today for as little as $2 a month at patreon.com/refusefascism. Thanks to those sharing the show on social media, commenting on our YouTubes, everyone who buys our merch to support and spread the show. See the show notes to get your sticker packs, your beanies, t-shirts. A special thank you to those who help the algorithms that help grow our audience by rating and reviewing the show on Apple Podcasts, rating on Spotify, reviewing on their listening platform of choice. They boost the show so much. After listening, please share your thoughts to help others find this resource. In today's show, we're sharing an interview with author and essayist A.R. Moxon, discussing the nature of domination and vengeance, the underpinnings of accommodation, rejecting the fascist offer, and the need to understand the worst to envision the best. But first, we need to talk about this week in fascism. Every day, Trump and his cohort double down on impersonating the fascists of the 1900s. But one element of this 21st century American fascist agenda is gradually coming to the fore in a way that really contrasts with Hitler. Hitler spoke of a 1,000-year Reich, the perpetual glory and power of his chosen people. As fucked up as that was, as fucked up as that is, Donald Trump is seemingly on a mission to accelerate the destruction of the planet and the very web of life that undergirds the future of even his ubermensch, white Christian American men. This fascism, and let's be clear, it is fascism, binds the most disturbingly nihilistic cruelty with end times Christian fanaticism, all geared towards maximizing the most immediate and unsustainable exploitation of all human and natural resources, hearkening the destruction of the Earth's ability to sustain life. Just this week, Trump has opened up large swaths of forest, 3 times the size of California, to logging. He has advanced the destruction of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. He has exploited a rarely used loophole in the Endangered Species Act in order to render it moot, and terminated dozens of leases for infrastructure belonging to the national park system. Zoe Schlanger, writing for The Atlantic, a piece titled "The Trump Administration's Environmental Pylon," describes the regime's assault on environmental justice, writing, quote, "As part of its purge of so-called DEI initiatives, the administration put 160 EPA employees who work on environmental justice on leave, rescinded Biden's executive orders prioritizing this work, and pushed to terminate, quote unquote, to the maximum extent allowed by law, all environmental justice offices and positions by March 21st, end quote. The most powerful empire in the history of the world, with a fully fleshed out scientific understanding of the massive effects their system is having on the world, is charging full steam ahead over the edge of this cliff. And yet still, at this late hour, even the majority of those who recognize this trajectory are continuing to simply go along with life as normal. This must change. We must change it. And as you know, on Tuesday, March 4th, before a joint session of the U.S. Congress, Trump delivered a bloody-jawed Nazi speech. It was like all things Trump, a grotesque cocktail of reality TV, of spectacle, vengeance, and boundless cruelty. He exploited personal tragedies, parading victims before the cameras, wielding their pain as a weapon to justify harsher state violence, particularly against immigrants, against trans people, and other oppressed groups. Trump bragged about his quote-unquote accomplishments, bragging about terrorizing immigrants in the trans community, about imposing Christian nationalism, purging the federal government, destroying the environment, defying court orders, gutting the rule of law, boasting about threatening any country that doesn't submit to U.S. power, and much more. And while he pummeled the opposition, used the Democratic Party as props, for which they all too willingly played the part, the Republic-Fascist Party demanded decorum. There can be no decorum with fascism, only refusal. His speech was a further declaration that fascism is consolidating. Fascism, not a curse word, fully imposed, is a radically oppressive and repressive form of rule over the people of this country with devastating impact on the people of the world. To give you a sense of the full speech without you having to listen to the 2-hour-plus Nazi rally, here are some clips that were compiled by the RNL Show that do a really good job at summarizing the totality of the horror that was on display.
My administration has launched the most sweeping border and immigration crackdown in American history. The criminals, killers, traffickers, and child predators who were allowed to enter our country under the open border policy of these people, the Democrats, the Biden administration, the open border insane policies that you've allowed to destroy our country. These people sitting right here will not clap, will not stand, and certainly will not cheer for these astronomical achievements. They won't do it, no matter what. In recent years, our justice system has been turned upside down by radical left lunatics. And as we reclaim our sovereignty, we must also bring back law and order to our cities and towns. I terminated the ridiculous Green New Scam. I withdrew from the unfair Paris Climate Accord. I withdrew from the corrupt World Health Organization. I signed an executive order banning public schools from indoctrinating our children with transgender ideology. We've ended the tyranny of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. We have removed the poison of critical race theory from our public schools, and I signed an order making it the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female.
One thing Trump has vowed to do, but did not yet do in his speech this past week, is invoke the Insurrection Act. While some misguided influencers have used Trump's promise to dissuade folks from protesting, his threats were never constrained by the existence of an actual or perceived insurrection. One of the executive orders Trump signed on his first day instructed the Department of Defense and Homeland Security to investigate whether they can justify invoking the Insurrection Act over what they have deemed the migrant emergency. This investigation is set to issue the report by April 20th at latest. Yet they are not waiting to put the pieces into place. Homeland Security has been acquiring all kinds of facilities across the country, most likely to use as mass detention space, aka concentration camps, including parts of military bases and abandoned prisons. The military purge that we detailed a few episodes ago is explicitly geared towards removing any roadblocks in the way of their promised crimes against humanity. And the complicity in advance from institutions ranging from hospitals to universities to arts institutions and more is setting the stage for bringing millions into complicity with the crimes of this regime. Here's an example that highlights complicity in advance, the intense repercussions Trump is doling out for perceived disloyalty, and the true extreme aims of the fascist agenda. Trump stripped $400 million of federal grants and contracts to Columbia University. Let's see why. Inside the hallowed walls of Columbia University, students are being expelled for criticism of Israel, chilling discourse campus-wide. The administration has repeatedly invited the NYPD onto campus to brutalize their students. gaslighting the world by pronouncing that their actions are undertaken to quote-unquote protect Jewish students, when a significant number of the people their goons are assaulting and punishing are Jewish students. This has been a clear strategy from the university administration, not only to impose chilling restrictions on academic freedoms and student life and threaten the lives and safety of those speaking out against the genocide in Gaza, but to sidestep any accountability, instead placing the responsibility for these draconian actions onto Jewish people as a whole. This didn't start with Trump. In fact, it started well before Trump won the election. Yet this was not enough. Trump pulled this funding, that's $400 million, that's 11 zeros, from the university as punishment for what the government describes as the Ivy League school's failure to squelch anti-Semitism on campus. Did the university respond with outrage, joining students in protests, calling on other institutions of higher learning to disrupt business as usual and repudiate this regime? No. The next day, the university reportedly sent out guidance to not interfere with ICE activities on campus. And at 8 p.m. last night, Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian activist and recent Columbia grad, who was the lead negotiator in last year's Gaza Solidarity Encampment, was detained by the Department of Homeland Security from his apartment building, a building owned by the university. Khalil was in the country on a student visa and has since obtained a green card. Yet after their agents claimed both his student visa and green card had been revoked. This comes on the heels of the State Department announcing plans to deport students for pro-Palestinian activism. We don't know what's in the hearts of the university's interim president or her cohort, but we do know that when institutions collaborate with fascism, they become little more than instruments of imposing that cruel and brutal future society-wide. The regime's actions are structured to send the message to colleges and universities across the country that the only acceptable stance is complete and total subordination to the full fascist program. Your elite status won't protect you. Existing in liberal strongholds won't protect you. Even exercising draconian repression won't necessarily protect you. The regime's goals don't end at crushing dissent. They proudly hate the very idea of higher learning, liberal education, of the severely proscribed, quote-unquote, academic freedom available today. They will not stop until they turn all education into their, quote-unquote, patriotic indoctrination. Right alongside the fascist hatred for education is their disdain for art. As just one example, this week, the National Endowment for the Arts issued new guidance restricting grants from being issued to any artist whose work touches on what they call, quote-unquote, gender ideology. Yet, this is one more place where the accommodation of the elites has already taken hold. Last Sunday, the most vaunted stars of that so-called liberal bastion of Hollywood came together at the Oscars to celebrate the past year's greatest works. Hundreds of people with power, influence, money, talent, immense privilege, surrounded by their supportive peers, avatars, and beneficiaries of a culture under direct attack by the fascists in the White House. And yet, there was not one defiant repudiation of the fascist Trump regime, not one call to protest, not one ode to resistance, not one act of courage against a fascism consuming our society at large. What the fuck is happening here? This accommodation comes from the top. Let's go back to Tuesday, March 4th. Trump speaking to the joint session of Congress, where he laid out his cruel and deadly accomplishments, promising nightmares to come. Almost half of those in attendance were elected not for any inspiring vision, but simply on the promise that they would hold the line against Trump. What did we see? A few wore pink, a few of them held up paddles as though they were trapped by the decorum of a silent auction, with weak messages expressing little more than slight discomfort with the fascist assault on humanity. One held a piece of paper with, quote-unquote, "This is not normal," written on it, and stood dumbfounded when one of their fascist adversaries ripped it from their hands. There was only one example of the bravery needed. Representative Al Green, one man grabbing his cane and standing up and calling out Trump's lies. He was immediately dragged out, while his peers in the Democratic Party said nothing and continued to play along. As Jeff Charlotte described well, as Wes Anderson characters not knowing they are in a Quentin Tarantino movie. And for Representative Al Green's act of courage, he was censured, not only by the fascists, but by 10 of his Democratic Party peers. We can't say that the Democratic Party did nothing. No, they have censured the one who stood up, have condemned those who walked out, and are reportedly pressuring anyone, quote unquote, out of line in one-on-one meetings. That line, accommodation to fascism. And not to forget, the official Democratic Party opposition speech, delivered by a proud former member of the CIA who served under Bush, who waxed about the greatness of Ronald Reagan and how it was good he was in the office during the Cold War. No, we cannot rely on the Democratic Party's leadership, who complacently rely on the very norms and processes that the Trump regime shreds by the hour. There can be no conciliation or collaboration between the world we want and the country the MAGA fascists want. We have no common cause with them. We are inundated by high-profile examples of what is not meeting the moment, what is not going to cut it. Actions that minimize the threat from folks that don't dare dream of the possibility of defeating this fascism. And so we're all confronted with the question, what will we do to bring real resistance to life? What will you do to bring real resistance to life? In contrast to what I just detailed, there were important seedlings of real resistance this past week. The protest Refuse Fascism, organized outside Trump's speech, while in size far below what was needed, displayed real righteousness and brought together people from diverse viewpoints and backgrounds, demanding the fascist Trump regime must go. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Hundreds of people had traveled from across the country to participate, even as another group who had called for the protests had called it off. Cheers to all those who made it possible and all who came out. We salute the thousands who joined the Stand Up for Science marches across the country this past Friday and all who took to the streets yesterday on International Women's Day in big cities and small towns across the country, denouncing the patriarchal chains of our society, the violent resurgence of misogyny and male supremacy, and many connecting all of that to the demands that this fascist regime must go. Refuse Fascism organized protests in over a dozen places, reaching thousands of people with the message, "Stop the war on women and LGBTQ people. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. The fascist Trump regime must go." And organizing people to stand up, resist, protest, to call millions into the streets in growing numbers again and again and again, until Trump MAGA fascism is driven from power. Check out our social media feeds at Refuse Fascism for photos and videos from this past week's protests that we organized. It's important that all these tens of thousands of people came out this week, breaking the routines, expressing their outrage, and it's vitally important that people saw multiple days of action with the through line of masses denouncing and repudiating the fascists in the White House, demanding that they must go. The fact that there was scant coverage illuminates the need for these actions to urgently grow exponentially so that they cannot be ignored. This week powerfully showed the potential for sustained disruptive protests united in demanding the ouster of the fascist Trump regime. I urge you to go to refusefascism.org and read A Call to Conscience, A Call to Act that is posted there. Discuss it with others, add your name, and spread it everywhere. I'll be discussing it on next week's episode. With that, here is my interview with A.R. Moxon. Today, I am honored to speak with A.R. Moxon, novelist and essayist. His books include The Revisionaries and Very Fine People. He has a newsletter, The Reframe. So glad to be getting the chance to speak with him after reading him for some time. So welcome. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we go further into your examination of this fascist movement in this country, I feel like we have to talk about what I see as last night's Nazi speech that Trump delivered. And I don't know if you wanted to share any thoughts on that, but I feel like we have to start there. Either you want to talk about what it represented, you want to talk about what it tells you about the DEFCON level for fascism, or any part of it. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, first, I must confess, I've been guarding my sanity. I don't tend to watch a lot of televised Trump. I don't tend to watch a lot of televised news in general. I get my news from printed material, and that's legacy with a healthy dollop of skepticism. Legacy media like the Washington Post, New York Times, quite aware of what they are and how they've been meeting this moment, but also a lot of really great independent journalists who are doing vital work. And as such, I didn't watch the telecast. My understanding is that it was perhaps the longest. I think I read that somewhere of any.
It was 2 hours at least.
I wasn't going to do that to myself. I have read, seen some reactions. I've seen some clips. It should be understood that I'm probably not the one to speak definitively about the State of the Union address. However, what I saw was what you could expect to see from someone like Trump. It is an alternate reality. It's a fiction that's being put forward. It's being put forward in order to force all of us to try and live within this sort of nightmare reality that has become the mainstream of Republican thinking and Republican rhetoric and their overall purpose and mission. Does it raise the DEFCON level? It doesn't for me. I think it places us pretty accurately where we are right now. Trump has control of the Oval Office. He's using it exactly in the ways that the architects of Project 2025 guaranteed they would. While resistance isn't futile, the resistance was futile last night. And it was absolutely not meeting the moment. It hasn't been since well before the election. Just a real performative lack of understanding of just how dire this moment is and the sort of bravery and disruption that is really needed from our leaders right now. It's dispiriting to see. I think that the activities that have been happening leading up to the State of the Union have, for me, been far more alarming, but it is certainly a confirmation of where we are. It was a show of the Republican domination, of Trump's domination. Yeah, alarming as such.
The word domination really strikes me in terms of what was on display, the way in which Trump went after his opposition, even while in power, to which each word was celebrated by the Republicans.
Yeah, he promised revenge to people who want revenge, and that's really what this has been. It's been a campaign of vengeance against the American population, the population of the United States writ large. Not only those of us who have not supported him, have been resistant, who have voted against him, who have demonstrated against him, who have written against him, but also really, even those who have supported him. There's a real anti-human spirit at play in everything that this organization does and says. I don't know if I love the word domination, but I think it's probably the correct term of what's being displayed. They shouldn't be dominant. They should be opposed, and yet they aren't. And the spectacle of that is front and center, and it's very present in our lives.
You had alluded to the activities prior to the speech that had caused you greater concern. Is there anything in particular that you see as defining in that way?
It's sort of like naming your least favorite boulder in an avalanche. It's by design, right? They are, as it's been put before, they're flooding the zone with shit. They are overwhelming. It's shock and awe. It's all of these terms that we've heard many times, but it really is what they're doing. The writer Radley Balko had a roundup about a week ago of just the previous 5 days. And I started to read it, and you just get buried under it. I think that what Radley did there was absolutely a crucial service in this moment, especially of memory holding and of gaslighting and just straight lying and just flooding the zone to remember. But it really does get overwhelming. Some of the things that have alarmed me the most are the overall purging of the military and the installment, not just in the military, but across the board, of loyalists, of real creepy authoritarian types who clearly have pledged their loyalty to Trump and do so overtly. I think the story that came out from Wired recently that shows that Trump is just openly taking $1 million paychecks and $5 million paydays for meetings with him, either in groups. You can get them in a group for $1 million, or for $5 million, you can get them by yourself. It's just astonishing levels of corruption that kind of just is water over the dam in an age when you have, and this is probably the most alarming thing, Elon Musk just running through the federal government and just firing indiscriminately or seemingly indiscriminately, and at the same time with discrimination in mind, sort of an ironic thing, with the intention seemingly to be just the destruction of society. I guess I've named some of my favorite boulders in this avalanche. Those are the things that really alarm me. But then an hour later, I'll reflect back on this conversation, and there'll be another half dozen outrages that I can't believe I didn't mention. I should mention the persecution and the erasure of trans people from public life, the clear intention of menace and harm, terror, and frankly, murder that is inherent in the intention of that activity. This whole podcast could probably be me listing these things. Yes, I'll reflect back on this conversation and I'll think, oh, there's one other and another and another. It's all bad and it's none of it good. It is purposeful. It is something that is being celebrated by people who are cheered by cruelty and by destruction. And that, perhaps more than anything, is the drumbeat of dread that we're being forced to feel.
I think that even amongst people who share our concern and could list the things that you've listed and continue to list, there's still a desire to look away from people wanting that, and that cruelty and that intentional brutality being something that could be celebrated, I think is something that is still far too surprising to too many people. One of the things that you were saying about the lack of opposition to meet the moment resonated with a piece that you had written where you had pointed to never accepting the fascist offer. When they're offering you unity and peace, what that really is. And basically, there's no reconciliation with the fascists except on their terms. I was wondering if there was anything else that you wanted to speak to on that as it relates to the Democratic Party.
I think that kind of circles us back to what we see in the Democratic response to the State of the Union, the Democratic response to a lot of what's happening. And it should be said, the Democrats are not by any means a monolith. That can be a weakness. I think it could be a strength to have a diversity of methods of opposition. But as a group, on average, and especially within their leadership, there is this much noted, much derided reversion to norms and a defense not of the Constitution or not of the citizens of the United States, but of the norms of the practice of government as they have known it. I think that when we think about the fascist offer, your question, it's an offer of false unity. This is by no means unique or original to me, but I think fascism can be understood to a degree by looking at the dynamics of bullying and of narcissistic abuse and of enablement of the same. A bully needs a system that enables them. I think that the fascist offer is very much also the bully's offer, right? The narcissist's offer that there would be some peace or some unity or some comity that is available if you are willing to find common ground. Not because fascists care about common ground for any reason other than as leverage to use against those that they intend to harm, but because the fascist or the narcissist or whatever other metaphor you might want to use to describe this ideology is always going to point toward some good thing. Who doesn't like peace? Who doesn't like comity? Who doesn't want to find common ground? How could you say that those are bad things? And yet, the formulation for this piece is to ignore all of the people that are currently being targeted. And the truth of the matter is that the fascist intention and the fascist system is a machine that eats people, and it's not going to stop until it has run out of people. So the people that you're abandoning today, there's a famous poem about this. We all learned it in high school, I thought. And so, yes, the essay that you're referring to is called Fighting in the Dark. It's on the Reframe, my newsletter. And it was written in the days following the election when it became clear that we were going to get another Trump presidency that was going to last for however long it's going to last. That was one of the conclusions, right? Was how do we oppose now? How do we think about this? And how do we approach it with something like hope and resolve? One of the things that we must do is understand that the only way out is through complete solidarity with humanity, because what this movement is, like every fascist movement, like all authoritarian movements before it, this is an anti-human effort. The practitioners deny their own humanity in the service of denying everyone else's. So we really must refuse that fascist offer. Whenever it is offered to us, we must understand it's not a real peace that's being offered to us. And there's no peace that we can make with a group that seeks to harm and terrorize and murder our friends and neighbors, that doesn't make war with them.
Couldn't agree with you more. It's why our slogan is, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. I wanted to talk a little bit about mythology, especially as it relates to the mythologies that we have in the United States, because it's something that you've been exploring and writing very eloquently about. America has many mythologies. Trump embraces a certain kind of American mythology, but it's not the only one. In fact, Trump coming to power in this moment, in this way, makes many of the more liberal American mythologies untenable. The fact that this shining city on the hill is filled with tens of millions of fascists really challenges ideas of American exceptionalism, or ideas that the slaveholders' constitution is magically geared towards creating a more perfect union. I was wondering what thoughts you have on what this moment says about these mythologies and delusions, and what do you think needs to replace them?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I do believe, and I spend a lot of time with this, so I write a lot about it because I think a lot about this. I think that what we're dealing with, I sometimes say, is competing human spirits. I don't mean it in a woo-woo sort of way. I mean it in the sense of what happens when collective human belief actualizes in the world, which is how things happen. It's not an unmeasurable thing. But you could also say we're dealing with competing stories. And Trump's story is one of, we're the best, we're exceptional. It's the manifest destiny, a phrase that he's literally started using, right? It's the idea that we conquer because we deserve to conquer, that might makes right, that wealth is proof, ownership is the proof of the right to dominate, domination is proof of right in general. And that's the story. And it's a popular story. It's a founding myth of our country. And a lot of people have believed it, and people have fought wars over it. American exceptionalism, that we are exceptionally good, and the proof is that we are exceptionally good is that we win. And we have a competing story, and we have had a competing story for quite some time. It's a better story, and it's one where we are the shining city on the hill, I suppose, or we are a place where anyone can come and where all are welcome, where we say, send me your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That's a good story, I think. The idea of human equality, of human freedom, of a place where everyone has equal rights under the law, where everyone is equal and equality is our great value and diversity is a great strength. That's a good story. I think where we get messed up is we get American exceptionalism mixed into it, and we start to treat it as something that's already true and has always been true. And we start to treat it as something that has already been accomplished, and therefore it will ask nothing of us and it won't cost us anything. And I'm speaking for myself, really. A lot of my writing has been me trying to kind of climb out of this pit of unawareness that I realized many years ago now that I was in. And I believe that. I believe we're the greatest country in the world. And, we freed the slaves and we ended racism forever. That's not a problem. And all of these things, which were really just outcomes of my privilege and my incuriosity and moral laziness. But I think that is the liberal story. The story of liberal America is to believe all of these wonderful things, but to think that there's no cost for us today, and to believe that it's already accomplished, and to believe that we are in some way the special ones who have done this thing, and all the rest of the world is coming to us to learn how to be the good people. It just doesn't hold up. It's a real house of cards. And so a lot of people, I think, are still clinging to that. It's causing them to fall into sort of enabling traps. If you believe that part of it, if you don't think, well, this is an ideal that we now have to work through, and it's going to be a struggle, and it's going to take a lot of work on our part, and the more that we have, the more it's probably going to cost us. Whether it be in the benefits that we've derived from the society or the privileges that have allowed those benefits. When we don't do that, when we think of it as something that's already ours, we traffic in supremacy, we traffic in the foundational lies of the other story. That other story gets mixed in. And when that happens, we become very susceptible to the true believers of the other story of supremacy, that some people matter and the other people don't. And those that don't matter deserve to be owned by those who do matter. And that's the fascist urge. When we don't make that leap, and a lot of people who are either well-meaning or think they're well-meaning do fall into that, it leaves us very vulnerable to the fascist story because we are still within the frame of traditional American supremacy.
Thanks for that breakdown. Recently, you wrote a piece on your Substack, The Worst and the Dimmest. You're writing about what you call, as in your title of the piece, The Worst and the Dimmest. And one thing that I took away from it is that we really need people to understand that the fascists are categorically evil and bad. And a lot of ideas have both good and bad people who believe in them, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who have chosen to base their lives around abject hatred of the other. I was wondering if there was anything that you wanted to lift up from that piece that you think that if people were able to grasp now as they look at the Musks, as at Trump, at the regime as a whole, what people should be getting that maybe they're still.
Yeah, when I think of that, that was a few weeks ago. And maybe as just a quick point of clarity, you'd mentioned my Substack. I moved off of Substack about a year ago.
Sorry, I use it as a shorthand for newsletter, and I need to change that.
No, I know. Yeah, they're pretty dominant. I'm on Ghost. I just mentioned that because I'm not going to spend time negotiating around Substack or relitigating that. They do platform and monetize Nazis. That was enough of a problem for me that I moved off. There are other people who had already, and some of them are, in marginalized groups that are directly targeted by Substack that are still there. So I try and kind of take a light hand. I was in a position where it was a pain to move off, but it wasn't the most terrifying thing in the world. And I think for some people who really do rely on that income for their livelihood, it's a really big move and a difficult thing. So it was the right thing for me to do, let's say, and I'm glad that I did it. I do cross-post there still, and I may for a time, and that's just because a lot of the readership was there and they consume it through the app. Even that may have run its course. It's been a year, but definitely I monetize and I host through Ghost. To return to your question, the worst and the dimmest. This is part of an overall, I guess it's kind of a loose series that I'm starting to make more of a tight series of what is it that we need to do now? And what is it that we need to be resisting? I've been calling it the billionaire scam. It's still fascism. It's still our traditional American story of supremacy, but it's finding its expression in this sort of billionairism. And, Musk and Trump have sort of become the embodiment of it. There's a few things that I would pull out of that piece that I would want to say. The first is that piece is part of a sequence that I'm trying to demonstrate, that it's the first step, which is facing the worst. I think we need to have awareness of what it is we're up against. And we have to really look at just how debased this ideology is and how inhumane, how cruel, how brutal, how celebratory in all of those things, the ways that it just negates any fine aspiration that we've ever had about ourselves as a society. It thoroughly negates any rationale that these people give for what they're doing. A moment's look can show you that they care nothing about efficiency or saving costs. They don't care about women's sports, certainly. They don't care about education. They don't care about, none of the things that they're pointing toward do they care about. And it's important to really see them for what they are for a couple reasons. First, I think it allows us to access our reaction to that. And a lot of times there's a lot being done, especially in the halls of power on networks of influence, to try to tamp these natural reactions down of disgust, of anger, fear often. These are rational responses to what they're doing. Speaking of rational responses, I think the other reason that we need to look at the worst is because we need to understand that they are telling us what they believe, and what they believe is that they are the people that matter and everyone else is subhuman and should be subjugated and should be removed from society. Whatever happens to them after that is no concern of theirs, unless they take a concern, in which case they can make sure that the suffering increases. It's punishment minded. It's all of these things. I think that the depravity of it requires our attention. But if you believe those things, then the things that they are doing, the cruelty, the slavery, and genocide that they're steering toward becomes a rational response. If you truly believe that you matter and other people don't, and that life has to be earned, and the way you earn it is by creating profit, and those who don't create profit, therefore, do not deserve life, and if they have life, it's theft and it deserves punishment, well, then what they're doing would seem rational, and it really puts the lie to everything they are. The last thing I would say is it's really good to look at how completely divorced from reality they are, and how wrong they are, how ignorant they are, the ways that they have denied their own humanity, because it shows the fact that they are in a system that is ultimately self-defeating. And not to be blithe about it, this is not a call for complacency. A lot of people are already being hurt very badly. They're doomed, I think. I do believe that, because I don't think that reality can be denied forever. And they simply aren't very good at anything but destruction. And eventually, something that is only efficient at creating this destruction, something that only exists to create destruction, will ultimately destroy itself. It has the seeds of its demise within itself. But at the same time, we have to recognize that this is not a moment to stop being concerned. A lot of damage is being done to everyone else in the meantime, and will continue to as long as they're allowed to keep destroying. But it shows just how much our system is optimized to allow this, just how much the way that we organize power and permission and privilege is optimized for the worst people to rise. But it also can give us some resolve to know that they themselves are failed. They're failed even before they start, because what they intend is something that is wrong and destructive and ultimately empty. That's the first thing we have to do. We have to look at the worst. But we look at the worst so that we can imagine the best and we can start moving toward the better.
Really important. Kind of closing in a similar way to the way we started, I guess. Close the circle a little bit. You talked about at the beginning how the list of actions that shock the conscience are daily, sometimes hourly, from this regime. There seems to be a wide swath of people out in the world who are not shocked, but continuously surprised by the regime's actions. People who seem to think that these are all isolated incidents, ends in themselves, or tenuously related issues that have to be dealt with, not a fully conceived program with direction and momentum. As you were talking about earlier, that these are intentional actions. You see it from apolitical rubes, and you are also seeing it from people in high positions within the Democratic Party. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what drives that and who is served by that.
my perspective on it. Certainly we see that. We can see it with a lot of Democratic politicians. We see it almost reaches comical proportions with quote unquote moderate Republican senators like Susan Collins, who's just constantly surprised that these things keep happening. They can't quite wrap their minds around the fact that people who say they intend to do horrible things keep doing horrible things. They believe the best case scenario when there's really not much reason to. I think so much of it goes back to a foundational spiritual alignment towards supremacy. Supremacy is something that believes that some people matter, other people don't. And one expression of that is that the people who don't matter should carry all the costs. And the people who do matter should inherit all of the benefits. And, one of the benefits would be not being to blame for anything that happens, right? This is how we get a picture of a narcissist or a bully, right? It's never our fault. It's never our fault. And so there is within the U.S. psyche, other places too, I'm sure, but I sit where I sit, so I see the country I see, this desire to never pay any costs and to never have to take any blame. It's why you'd get a country that believes in its own exceptionalism. It is to only get the good things, to only inherit the good that we've done as a nation, to never have to deal with the bad. Now that expresses itself, I think, or finds an expression in people who don't have awareness. Because if what you want is to avoid all costs, then one of the things you're going to avoid doing is repairing things that are broken and maintaining things that have been inherited, because those things get into cost, as does blame. What we see frequently is a sabotage of the overall process of repair. And that can be literal sabotage of the process of actual infrastructure bills. We can't fix our roads. We can't fix our bridges frequently. These things go on for decades and decades after they should have been done, but they can't be done because we don't want to pay the cost. But it can also be non-literal. It can be a sabotage simply of the process of knowing something is broken. So the first thing that gets sabotaged is awareness. And there are certainly campaigns to create misinformation and ignorance. If you become aware of something and you want to avoid costs, then the next thing to do is to find a reason to be complacent and to not enter the conviction that you might need to fix something, because then you would have to, of course, bear the cost, whether it's the inconvenience of the work or your time or your effort or your money. And so I think you find a lot of people who, if you point out what's going on, they'll say, oh, but it's not a big deal. And if you press them as to why it's not a big deal, they'll have some answer and it won't make a lot of sense. And if you press them on that one, they'll give you a different reason that might be diametrically opposed to the reason they just gave, because the point of it all for them is to not know and not care. There are definitely people who mean well and they get bamboozled. That can happen. There are people who the best they can do is just put one foot in front of the other and just try and stay alive, hand to mouth. That definitely happens in this country. And there's perhaps not as much time to even be aware of what's going on. And I would say that that's an intentional part of not dealing with poverty in this country, is that it exacerbates ignorance and it can exacerbate complacency. But I think that's what's going on with that. It's a desire to not know. I imagine you've had those conversations too, and you have conversations with people who you simply cannot help to see that something that is very clearly alarming is alarming. They will just retreat to, oh, I don't think that's going to happen. Oh, but what about this person did that thing one time? Or what about this? Or the more you do that, the more you have those conversations, the more you can start to get a kind of a sonar for, okay, this person doesn't know, not because they're incurious, but because there's some externality, versus this person doesn't know because they are opposed to knowing. And they don't care because they're opposed to caring, because they know that knowing and caring would lead to doing, and doing will get you into some kind of cost, and cost is the last thing that supremacy ever wants to pay. That's for other people. Look, I find myself in it as well. I don't want to be smug. I don't do as much as I can. I don't do as much as I should. There are times when I unplug. There are times when I realize that there's still work for me to do, for sure, all the time. And there are times where you have to kind of guard your sanity. You can't know it all. You can't keep track of it all. That's part of what they're doing. But there is a difference, I think, between people who are just kind of trying to protect their time and their energy and people who are just unplugging because they're still able to. It's kind of part of the fascist offer. Hey, if you just keep your head down, it's going to be fine for you. Pay no attention to the noises in the streets.
Well, I want to thank you for helping us pay attention, for knowing, caring, and acting in the ways that we need to in this moment. I want to add for those listening, maybe I'll go back and maybe we'll say more about this some other time, but resistance that stops at sacrifice isn't resistance, it's accommodation. We really need to be building the awareness that builds the refusal that's necessary to defeat what it is that we face in Trump and in the MAGA fascist movement. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughtfulness. And I will say, since I didn't comment earlier, yes, I speak to lots of smart people, but I also am speaking to you, and you have a good head on your shoulders. And whether you see yourself as just some guy, your work matters tremendously. And we all need to bring our talents to this struggle, whatever they are. And
whatever they are. That's right.
Yeah. And I'm glad that for you, it's your pen. So I just want to thank you again for coming on. And for those listening, how do you want folks to connect with your work? We're going to link to your books in the show notes. But besides your books, where should we go?
You can find all the links at armoxon.com. That'll have my newsletter. It'll have my books, etc. And the books you can get wherever books are sold. The newsletter is the-reframe.com. Those would be the spots. You can find me on Blue Sky, juliusgoat.blisky.whatever. Type in Julius G. See how that does for you. That's mostly when it comes to social media where I hang out these days.
Perfect. We'll put that in the show notes. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. There is a news statement, as I mentioned earlier, up at refusefascism.org. A call to conscience, a call to act. I encourage every listener to read it, add their name, discuss it, spread it. Find it in the show notes, and of course, it's up on refusefascism.org. We'll be delving into it, as promised, in next week's episode. Want to support the show? Amazing! Spread the imperative and support the show by getting merch. See the show notes for t-shirts, sticker packs, and beanies. Join our Patreon community to fuel refusal of this fascist nightmare. Join at patreon.com/refusefascism. Or for no monies at all, share the show with others. Rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on our socials or YouTube. It makes a difference and is so appreciated. Speaking of socials, be sure to connect with us on social media at Refuse Fascism, including on Blue Sky, and you can find me on TikTok at Sam Goldman RF. As always, thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkleman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers, we have transcripts available for each show. So be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. You'll also get updates on actions and ways to get involved in the movement demanding the fascist Trump regime must go. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.